It was not a decision born of a single argument or a dramatic scandal, but of 1,000 silent moments. In the quiet corridors of a monarchy seeking its modern footing, King Charles III faced a choice that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with legacy. It was a choice between the love that once reshaped the crown and the steadfast presence that promised to secure its future. This is the story of the private reckonings and public calculations that led to a seismic, unspoken shift, where the future of the House of Windsor quietly, definitively aligned behind the Princess of Wales. The morning dawned gray and soft over London, a muted light settling on the palace rooftops. Inside Clarence House, King Charles III sat alone in his study, the weight of the coming day already pressing upon his shoulders. The room was a testament to a life lived in accumulation. Watercolors of landscapes he'd painted, shelves of philosophical texts, a well-worn leather chair that had molded itself to his form over decades. On the desk, a single, formal memo lay. It concerned the planning for his coronation, a document that should have been a mere logistical stepping stone. But a particular line regarding the roles and processions of the Queen Consort and the Princess of Wales had caught in his mind like a thorn. It was a bureaucratic phrase that had unlocked a vault of personal history, of public duty, and of a future he was now solely responsible to shepherd. For Charles, the choice was never as simple as a public might imagine. Camilla, the Duchess of Cornwall, now his Queen Consort, was his haven. Their love story, forged in controversy and tempered by time, was the bedrock of his private happiness. She understood his rhythms, his passions, his exasperations with the system, as he often called it. She made him laugh with her earthy, unfiltered wit. In her presence, the tense boy who had always felt judged could simply be a man. She had endured decades of vilification, of being labeled the other woman, and had emerged with a dignity that had, slowly and painfully, won a grudging public respect. To honor her was to honor his own hard-won peace. Yet, his gaze drifted to a photograph on a side table. It showed Catherine, the Princess of Wales, at a recent engagement. She was crouching low, eye level with a child, her smile not a practiced royal beam, but a genuine, warm curve. Behind her, William stood, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, his own expression one of quiet pride. The image spoke of something beyond the moment. It spoke of continuity. Catherine had entered the family as a young commoner, navigated the intense scrutiny with a steely grace that belied her gentle demeanor. She had learnt the ropes, not with a sense of entitled duty, but with a diligent, almost academic application. She studied briefing papers, remembered names and personal details with an eerie accuracy, and approached her charitable work not as a patron but as a partner. Charles saw in her the embodiment of a modern monarchy he himself had long advocated for, one that was empathetic, connected, and subtly powerful in its service. More importantly, he saw the mother of his grandchildren, the future King George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis. Their stability, their sense of a normal life amidst the chaos of royalty, was paramount. And that stability was inextricably linked to Catherine's calm center. William, his heir, was a different kind of sovereign in waiting, more direct, less patient with courtly nuance, fiercely protective of his family's space. His partnership with Kate was his greatest strength. To undermine her, even unintentionally, was to risk fracturing the very foundation of the monarchy's next century. The silence in the palace that morning was not an empty one. It was a silence thick with the ghosts of past choices and the whispers of futures yet unwritten. It was in this quiet that Charles began his real work, not as a king signing papers, but as a paterfamilias weighing an invisible crown. He thought of his mother, the late queen, whose reign was defined by a stoic withholding of personal preference in service of the institution. Could he afford such luxury? The institution was now cracked from recent years of family strife and public disillusionment. It needed more than neutrality. It needed active, strategic nurturing. He recalled a small, telling moment from a family gathering at Sandringham the previous Christmas. There had been a chaotic, joyful present opening session for the children. Camilla had observed with amused detachment, offering a witty remark about the noise. Catherine, however, was on the floor, helping Louis assemble a complicated toy, her laughter mingling with his. William had caught Charles's eye across the room and given a small, contented shake of his head, as if to say, "This is madness." It was a scene of unvarnished family life, and Charles, standing somewhat apart, had felt a dual pang. One of gratitude for Camilla's companionship that allowed him to observe such scenes without the ache of loneliness, and another, sharper one of understanding. The camera of the world's attention would one day fix itself permanently on William, Catherine, and their children. The monarchy's survival depended on that focal point being strong, united, and resonant with the public. The choice, then, was not about love or loyalty. It was about optics and oxygen. Camilla had her place, earned and secure. But the institution required a clear, unobstructed channel to its future. Every resource, every moment of favorable publicity, every symbolic gesture needed to flow toward that channel, reinforcing its banks. To allow any ambiguity, any sense of a competing court or faction, was to reintroduce the very dynastic dramas that had plagued them for generations. The firm had to be streamlined, its narrative singular and forward-looking. Charles did not summon advisors that day. He walked the gardens instead, the damp earth scent filling his senses. He thought of the long arc of history, of how monarchies fell when they became tangled in their own internal conflicts, blind to the changing world outside the gates. He was by nature and nurture a man prone to introspection and doubt. But on this, a cold clarity settled over him. The monarchy's healing, which had begun with his mother's passing and his own accession, could not be a return to any past, not even his own. It had to be a deliberate, unwavering step into a future defined by William and Catherine. When he returned to his desk, the memo about the coronation plans seemed different. The thorn was gone. The decision, though he would never voice it in such crude terms, was made. Kate over Camilla, not in affection, but in strategy. Not in the present, but for the forever. He picked up his pen, not to write a decree, but to begin the subtle, unstoppable process of recalibration. It would be done with kindness, with respect for Camilla's position, but it would be done. The silence in the palace was no longer heavy. It was the silence of a path being chosen, of a king finally, understanding that his greatest act of love for the crown might be to gracefully clear the stage for the ones who came next. The decision, once crystallized in the king's mind, did not announce itself with a bang. It began to seep into the machinery of the monarchy like a slow, deliberate dye, coloring actions and shaping protocols in ways visible only to those who knew the code. The first signs were not in grand proclamations, but in the quiet geography of royal engagements and the unseen hierarchy of the daily court circular. A proposed joint engagement for the Queen Consort and the Princess of Wales, a visit to a women's shelter, was gently restructured. Instead of appearing as a tandem, a powerful but potentially confusing image of dual feminine authority, the visit was split. Camilla would attend alone the following week, receiving her full and deserved spotlight. Catherine's visit, however, was scheduled for earlier and was woven into a broader, multi-year initiative on early childhood development that she was personally spearheading. The press release positioned it not as a one-off charity visit, but as a strategic step in the princess's long-term vision. The briefing to newspapers, coming from sources deep within the palace, emphasized Catherine's deep, research-driven approach and her unparalleled connection to future generations. The language was careful, respectful to Camilla, but the directional nudge was unmistakable. Behind the scenes, Charles initiated a series of private lunches, not with his son and daughter-in-law together, but separately. With Camilla, These meals were filled with shared reminiscences and tender assurances. He spoke of her invaluable role, her hard-won position, and his unwavering love. He was shoring up the walls of their private world, ensuring she felt secure even as the public wind shifted. With William, the conversations were more direct, focusing on the long-term vision for the crown, the challenges of modern leadership, and the importance of a united front. With Catherine, they were different still. Charles, often seen as a distant figure to her in earlier years, now sought her opinions. He asked about her early childhood projects findings, listened to her thoughts on the monarchy's engagement with mental health charities, and discussed the subtle pressures of raising children in the spotlight. He was, in effect, anointing her with his attention, signaling to the household staff and advisors that her voice carried a new, profound weight. Camilla, no stranger to reading the subtle currents of palace life, perceived the shift. It was in the way certain papers crossed her desk for notation rather than decision. It was in the slight rearrangement of the upcoming royal tour schedules, where Catherine's solo engagements in key Commonwealth realms were given more prominent billing. There was no slight intended, no diminishment of her formal status, but the oxygen Charles had considered was being subtly redirected. She felt it, not as a betrayal from Charles, whom she understood better than anyone, but as the cold touch of the institution she had fought so hard to join. It was the monarchy doing what it always did, prioritizing its survival above the hearts of those within it. She responded with a dignified, if slightly more withdrawn, professionalism. Her public work remained robust, her style affectionately unchanged, but, in private, a certain wry sadness entered her humor. She had the love of the king, a truth no protocol could alter. That, she decided, would have to be enough. The true test. And the moment the silent choice became palpable to a wider circle came with the planning of the first major post-coronation state banquet. The question of precedence and placement was a minefield of symbolism. Traditionally, the queen consort would be the premier hostess, seated beside the visiting head of state. Yet, whispers from the king's private secretary suggested a fresh and future-facing tableau. The resulting seating plan was a masterpiece of diplomatic nuance. King Charles was at the center, of course. To his right sat the visiting president. To his left, however, was not Camilla, but Catherine. Camilla was placed on the other side of the president. Physically, the distances were small. Symbolically, they were canyons. As the royal family processed into the grand ballroom under the glittering chandeliers, the world saw it. Catherine, in a stunning tiara that had belonged to the late queen, her posture regal yet approachable, walked just a step behind Charles, with William beside her. Camilla, elegant and smiling, followed a pace behind with other senior family members. Photographs from the evening captured a telling moment. Charles was turned slightly in his chair, engaged in animated conversation with Catherine and the president, his hand gesturing toward William. Camilla, in the same frame, was conversing politely with the president's spouse, her profile to the camera, a study in correct attachment. The message was not of exclusion, but of orientation. The king's focus, and by extension the monarchy's, was angled decisively toward the future. William watched this unfold with mixed feelings. He was fiercely proud of Catherine, who carried the sudden increase in symbolic burden with her typical unflappable grace. He understood the brutal pragmatism of his father's decision. It aligned perfectly with his own desire to modernize and streamline the monarchy. Yet he also felt a pang of sympathy for Camilla, who had, in her own way, stood by his father through unimaginable trials. He made a point of seeking her out during the banquet's reception, engaging her in a long, laughing conversation, a small but genuine gesture of solidarity from the future to the past. For Catherine, the elevation was overwhelming. She felt the eyes of the room, the weight of history in the tiara on her head, and the silent expectation now settled on her shoulders. She had not asked for this, had never sought to eclipse anyone. Her strategy had always been one of steady, quiet competence, of being a supportive wife and a dedicated mother first. Now, she was being drafted into the center of a narrative she hadn't written. That night, in the private family apartments, she expressed her anxieties to William. "I don't want it to seem like we're pushing her out," she confessed, her voice quiet. William, practical as ever, took her hand. "We're not pushing. He's clearing the way. It's his job to manage the transition. Ours is just to be ready." Catherine nodded, but the reality of what ready meant had changed. The silence that had fallen over the palace was now a space she was expected to fill. The silent shift, having been established in the rarefied air of state banquets and private lunches, now began to manifest in the gritty reality of the monarchy's day-to-day work. Its public engagements, its media strategy, and its relationship with a sometimes skeptical British populace. This was where Charles's choice would be validated or would falter, not in the eyes of courtiers, but in the hearts of ordinary people. A critical opportunity arose with the Together for Tomorrow national tour, a series of visits across the UK aimed at highlighting community resilience. Initially conceived as a series for the king and queen consort, the plans were quietly but thoroughly reshaped. It became a tour featuring multiple pairings from the royal family, but the flagship visits to areas of significant economic challenge were assigned to William and Catherine. The briefing to the press was explicit. This was about the Prince and Princess of Wales connecting with the communities that would define their future reign. Charles and Camilla would handle more traditional ceremonial visits to historic towns and cathedrals important but rooted in the past. The difference in public reception was stark. William and Catherine's visits were marked by a palpable sense of energy. They were photographed in community kitchens, not just observing, but chopping vegetables. Catherine sat in circles with young mothers, listening to their struggles with the cost of living, her empathy generating headlines that felt genuine, not staged. William played football with teenagers in a youth center, his competitive streak and easy banter breaking down barriers. The media coverage was overwhelmingly positive, focusing on their relatability and their modern hands-on approach. The word Diana was mentioned more than once in commentary, not as a shadow, but as a lineage of connection that Catherine seemed to have inherited and refined. Charles and Camilla's parallel visits were respectful, well-attended, but carried a different tone. They were the grandparents of a nation, figures of authority and experience. The crowds were polite, often older. The coverage was dignified, but shorter, often tucked inside the news bulletins that led with William and Kate's more dynamic engagements. Camilla handled this with characteristic grit, focusing on her long-standing patronage of literacy causes, but the writing was on the wall. The public's appetite, and thus the media's oxygen, was flowing elsewhere. Charles watched the news reports each evening, a complex mix of emotions on his face. There was pride in his son and daughter-in-law's success, a validation of his strategic gamble. But there was also, perhaps, a touch of the melancholy that haunts every transitional figure, the understanding that the future has a louder voice than the present. This period also saw a tightening of the inner circle. Key advisors from William and Catherine's household began to be included in meetings that had previously been the sole domain of the king's senior staff. Discussions about the monarchy's digital strategy, its environmental commitments, and its charitable partnerships now featured Catherine's communications secretary and William's private secretary as central voices. Charles's own team, steeped in the traditions of a bygone era, were encouraged to listen and adapt. The infamous men in gray suits were gradually making room for a younger, more digitally savvy cohort whose loyalty was ultimately to the Wales's vision. It was a bloodless coup of bureaucracy, masterminded by the king himself. The most poignant personal moment of this phase happened away from all cameras, at Birkhall, Charles's cherished private home in Scotland. He had invited Camilla for a weekend, a deliberate retreat to reconnect away from the simmering tensions of London. On a walk through the damp heather, he finally addressed the unspoken. "None of this diminishes what you are to me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You are my wife, my heart. This is about the ship, my dear, ensuring it stays afloat for George and his children." Camilla, her hands buried in her coat pockets, looked out at the misty hills. She was quiet for a long time. "I know," she said finally. "I've always known the ship came first. I just hadn't realized I'd be asked to disembark quite so soon." There were no tears, just a profound, weary acceptance. Charles took her hand, and they walked on in a silence that was both a wound and a testament to their bond. He had made his choice for the crown, and in doing so had asked the love of his life to bear a quiet, personal cost. Back in London, Catherine was feeling the strain of her new prominence. The scrutiny intensified. Every outfit was analyzed not just for style, but for symbolism. Every public word was parsed for hidden meaning. The pressure to be perfect, to be the flawless bridge to the future, was immense. She found solace in the absolute normalcy of her children's routines, the school runs, the homework battles, the messy weekend adventures. This, she realized, was her armor. Her authenticity, so often commented on, was not a crafted strategy. It was her retreat. She was a princess who also worried about parking tickets and forgot to sign permission slips. This duality, this ability to inhabit both the grandeur of the palace and the chaos of a modern family kitchen, was the very thing that made her indispensable. She was living the future monarchy every day in real time. The silence around her was no longer an empty space to fill, but a stage she was learning to command simply by being herself. The culmination of Charles's silent decision arrived not with a single event, but with a season of them, a series of moments that wove the new reality into the immutable fabric of the monarchy's public story. The shift was now complete, moving from strategy to settled fact. The palace, once a place of competing currents, now operated with a unified, forward-driving purpose. The silence was no longer tense with uncertainty. It was the productive quiet of a machine perfectly calibrated. The annual Remembrance Day service at the Cenotaph provided the most powerful visual confirmation. For decades, the balcony of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office had presented a hierarchical snapshot of the monarchy. This year, the arrangement was subtly but powerfully altered. King Charles stood at the forefront, as was his right and duty. Immediately flanking him, however, were William and Catherine. William, in military uniform, stood tall and solemn beside his father, the heir in direct physical alignment with the sovereign. Catherine, in a deep, respectful black, was placed between them and the rest of the family, a pillar of the central trinity. Camilla, along with other senior royals, stood a respectful step behind, part of the supporting constellation, not the central orbit. The photograph flashed around the world, the past, the present, and the future captured in a single, unambiguous line of succession. The narrative was cemented. There was no going back. This new reality was tested almost immediately by a minor public relations crisis. An investigative newspaper report raised questions about the environmental impact of one of the king's long-standing estate management projects. In years past, Charles would have drafted a detailed, defensive rebuttal himself, or his office would have gone to war with the press. This time, the response was different. It was William's office, in close consultation with Catherine's team, that coordinated the public answer. They arranged for a joint visit by William and Catherine to a cutting-edge green technology center, where they spoke not about the specific allegations, but about the family's shared generational commitment to sustainable innovation. Catherine, in particular, spoke about teaching her children the importance of stewardship. The story pivoted from a defensive past to a hopeful future within 48 hours. Charles, watching from Sandringham, gave a slow nod of approval. They had not just managed the crisis, they had transcended it. The baton of narrative control had been passed, and the younger hands held it firmly. The Christmas broadcast, that most personal of royal rituals, became the emotional seal on the year. Charles delivered it from Buckingham Palace, his tone warm and grandfatherly. But the content was revealing. He spoke at length about looking forward with hope, about the joy and promise of new generations and the quiet, steadfast service that builds a future. The footage that accompanied his words was even more telling. There were the expected shots of his own work and a dignified, brief clip of Camilla at a literary event. But the majority of the film was a montage of William and Catherine's year. Catherine kneeling with children, William meeting veterans, the two of them laughing together on tour, tender moments with George, Charlotte, and Louis at public events. The final shot was a beautiful, candid picture of the Wales family, all five of them, walking through the autumn leaves at Balmoral, their backs to the camera, walking into a golden light. The message was subliminal but undeniable. The story is continuing, and it is bright. In the quiet week between Christmas and New Year, Charles hosted a small dinner at Windsor Castle. It was just the six of them, himself, Camilla, William, Catherine, and a significant inclusion, Prince George and Princess Charlotte, who were allowed to stay up for the first course. The conversation was light, filled with the children's stories and plans for the holidays. At one point, George, with the bluntness of a 9-year-old, asked his grandfather, "Papa, when you were King of England a long time ago, did you have to make lots of speeches?" The table laughed, and Charles's eyes met Catherine's over the glow of the candles. In her gaze, he saw no triumph, no arrogance at her new prominence. He saw only the same steady, kind, capable woman who had entered their lives, who had weathered storms and was now, unquestionably, the beating heart of the monarchy's next chapter. Later, as the children were ushered off to bed and the adults sat with a final drink, a deep, comfortable silence fell over the room. It was a different silence from the one that had gripped the palace months before. This was not the silence of a difficult choice pending, but the silence of a choice fulfilled, accepted, and woven into the family's fabric. Camilla and Catherine were speaking softly about a book they had both enjoyed. William and his father were discussing a piece of land management at Highgrove. The two couples, once the source of so much public drama and private complexity, now existed in a peaceful, parallel harmony. The palace and the family within it had found its equilibrium. Charles excused himself and walked to the long window, looking out at the dark outlines of the great park. He thought of the long, winding, and often painful path that had led here, his own lonely childhood, the failed marriage that haunted the nation, the decades of public disapproval, the hard-won love with Camilla, the loss of his parents, and the heavy crown finally placed upon his head. His reign, he knew, would be a bridge. But he now understood that a bridge's purpose is not to be lingered upon, but to be crossed. By making the choice to center Kate, her stability, her modernity, her family, he had ensured the crossing would be safe and the destination secure. The silence that fell over the palace was finally a peaceful one. It was the sound of an institution and a family pausing for a breath before stepping confidently into its tomorrow, its foundation solid, its path clear, its future held safely in the hands of a princess who had earned her place not by birth, but by quiet, unwavering grace.